You know, there's that first thing where you're like, if you don't know the sound of your voice when you hear it, you're like, oh my gosh. And then if you don't know what you look like on video, you're like, oh my gosh. But I'm like blinking like crazy.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, I guess these are like just things that you don't even not even aware that you're doing.
Do you have stage fright or social anxiety or anything like that?
Uh I wouldn't say so. I think like that's the thing. I'm very good just like, one on one. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, uh yeah, it's. I don't think I have stage fright. I think I just have not had to do it as
And that,
often as maybe, like when, again, my girlfriend's just like, yeah, I always have to present in thing, or like brand people are always like, yeah, always have to open off the certain thing or just talk about certain things. I'm always just kind of, I'm just doing the work, and then very rarely will I get to address, like 50 or more like people.
do
But
you
I don't
think
think I'm, yeah,
do
I
you,
don't think I'm like socially nervous.
what came first, the graphic designing or the more comfort in isolation? And I'm not
I
trying
don't
to be crude by saying
yeah,
comfort in isolation. I'm just saying that the habit or the lifestyle of a minimal interaction with people.
I guess it's not even the minimal interaction with people. I think like I'm a work hermit in general. Like I am
That's a good
social.
word for it. Work
I know a
hermit.
bunch
I
of
like that.
people. I think it's just like that up leveling of like, like, oh, I have to go to the trade show, or I have to go, like I didn't not to say even welcome, or just like there's no reason I wouldn't go. I think it's just like I'm not drawn to that aspect of like the industry, I guess, of just
Right.
like I need to be a figurehead or a face. I'm just like, oh, I'm happy to do the work. And then I'm happy to just kind of, show face and be like, hey guys, like, and then you just revert back into being a work hermit.
Right.
So I don't think, yeah, I'm necessarily like, you know, uh, shy or anything. I think it's just like, I always just think like, same thing with Mike, it's just like when you had the brand, you're just like, Greg is the, hey, everybody.
Yeah.
And Mike is just like, I'm in the back end doing all the heavy lifting and hard work. And, like, it doesn't need to be, that.
Is that how you saw it? Were you up close? I've been in California. You're talking about Mike Bortnick,
Yeah, yeah,
who's a mutual friend,
yeah,
and that's how we were connected.
yeah,
I've known him for over a decade. We speak every day.
yeah.
He
Oh, nice.
actually introduced us. So shout out to Mike Bortnick in
Yeah.
New York.
Oh,
But yeah,
I
he was actually one of the first guests, if not the first guest on this podcast.
yeah, nice.
So you can go back and listen to him rant about vintage comic book T-shirts, and he has an amazing collection of them, amongst other stuff.
Yeah, it's funny because it's like I think any collector, even as much as you have, 500 plus items or something, if someone was like, "Where did you get that?" It's like people will know and be like, "I got that at a estate sale in like 1995," and this sort of is just like, how do you remember all these different things and you
Yeah.
don't even know that you retain that information. But I think when you talk to so many different people collecting, and I think there's certain maybe traits or certain like through points where you're like, oh yes, like Mike could name off every single. It's like I bought this for like $100 off of this person here, and then you're like, oh okay, like
Uh
we
huh.
all we all have that sort of, I think, memory of our collections as much as like sometimes numbers get out of hand. I think we're just like, oh yes. I think even when you're out in the field and stuff and you're like, do I have this? It's like we kind of know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people think you need to like catalog collections, but like if it's your stuff, I've found that I don't need to be reminded of what I have. The doubles thing runs into the fold. I suppose is a proper way to say it. Like but overall, you know your stuff. So if you see something out in the wild, you're like, oh, even if it's like, do I have that or don't I have that? Most likely you'll buy it again. I imagine, right?
Yeah. I think like, you know, my collection is a little more cost prohibitive. You're like, ah, okay, like worst things worse. I just like spent $2 on something I might have already had. I know record people are very diligent about, what they have or uploading, or kind of, people that grade all their stuff and
Yeah.
slab it all. They're very like, okay, this I have a 6.5, but I want a, 8 or something or a 9. And then they're just very like like that. I think sometimes I'll do that where I'll have a placeholder of a marker and I'm like, well, this is kind of dinged up and kind of, and I'm like, oh, this will be a placeholder until I can get, a better one. Even if, yeah, you
I
just have
I find
internal.
like when you're passionate about it, you don't need to kind of write it down. It just is stored naturally
Yeah,
because you're so dialed into that specific thing,
yeah. No, it's
you
just
know?
funny, like, yeah, memory prompts and
Yeah.
say, just kind of like, I've always had this collection in the back of, whatever I'm doing. And then when I see it again, or someone asks about like, hey, let's talk about your collection. I'm like, oh yeah, I have this collection and I really like it. And I've spent, a good chunk of time perhaps curating or documenting it, but I just never feel that it's, like work or anything. I'm like, well, this is, yeah, it's just part of, part of what I'm doing. Yeah.
Which is very interesting because there's a utility to what you collect. So like the first kind of question that I had when I found out about you was, do you believe in things like animism where objects can have a soul or an essence? Do you think that in regards to pens, especially with, and I've heard this from like artists talking about the life that a certain brush has, the stroke that a certain pen has. Do you find that? Do you find that some of your markers in your black marker collection have a life to them when you use them, or something that kind of charges you in a
I,
certain
th-
way?
I think there's a certain romanticism any artist has with their tools, whether it's like, oh, this is my first MacBook, or this is the marker that I use to make this series of things. And sometimes it heightens the importance of it. Like maybe my first 10 markers, it wasn't anything like vintage or cool. It was just very utilitarian. But I'll be like, oh, but I drew, this entire series with it. And for whatever reason, like this elevates this sort of very basic like stockroom marker into like, that's one of my favorite markers. And people would be like, why? And it's like, well, like I just know it and I use it. And I think that's how people develop preferences for things. Um, yeah, sometimes I just talk to, other artists and people will be like, oh, I really miss this marker and it's discontinued. And, when I was living in, say, like Japan, this is all I used before Posca. And I think there are, whether it's skateboarding or graffiti or, people have a certain emotional attachment. Um, I guess that's what collection is to the things that you use. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you find like each certain pens jar certain memories, like you were talking about earlier? Like, do your pens serve as some sort of time capsule? Like, do you not have to write it down
Uh,
because you can kind of have recall when you see a certain marker of yours?
so I think like the first process I started collecting them and then I started drawing them at like a 1:1 scale. So I think when you start having to like render something, you just have to spend a little more time with it. Um, so I think before you know it, it's just like you start something and you're like, okay, well, I just first, I drew the first 25 markers 1:1 scale, and then you're like at 50 and then 100. And then you're like, you know, nobody's making me draw them, but for me, I'm just like, well, this is now part of the documentation.
Right.
Spending time and looking at it and kind of measuring it out. And I think, that extra bit, and then making some sort of like website entries as if you're, it could be insects or butterflies. I think that extra sort of care into something. I think from your original question, I think it's like there's certain markers that, the ones I use, I'll have a certain memory attachment, but then there's other ones that you're just acquiring like a vintage marker, but it'll be a reminder of where you got it or
Mm-hmm.
what you were doing at the time. But then, there's sometimes it's just like even an innocuous, like I went to Daiso and got this like dollar store marker. Like the marker isn't really that great or special or, prized, but I'm like, oh, okay, I remember going to Daiso with, a friend in like San Francisco, and this is when I got it. And, it might not be a like remarkable, story, but it is still, yeah, just like a nice moment, yeah.
Does it matter what you do with the marker?
Um, in
In terms of like, because you're a graphic design, you're a graphic illustrator,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Are you strictly hand style, or are you also
Uh,
on the computer?
I think like a lot of it is digital. I think like, over the course of like, decades, it's like a lot of the times in the beginning, that's what started the marker collection. I was just using black markers to render these like large Chinatown works. And I would
Mhm.
just, marker, 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 marker. And then I was like, okay, like I'll keep these. And I think, it becomes strictly utilitarian. And then I think as I started gaining more markers, I'm like, oh, okay, you just start, I'd say everything is special. Like part of it is like, I think a lot of the markers, as a graphic artist, I appreciate, it's like, oh, the font or the type or like the way the layout on the marker is. There's certain things you're like, wow, this is just like a really nice, marker. Um, and then other ones you're just like, well, I need to do some numbers. So I'll just get some common markers. But I think, yeah, I do a mixture of like hand-drawn illustration and then digital. But I think, that collecting of markers, I'll always have a certain, um, I guess, affinity or a sort of, yeah, special sort of bit of like, yeah, like, yeah, I just spent so much time just like drawing on the floor.
Did
But
you have a
yeah,
favorite
I
marker
think a
as a
lot of
kid?
people are like that with
Did you have a
that.
favorite mark?
Just Crayola, like, that's your, you have your little like, yeah, pencil case.
Uh-huh.
I think it's just be like your Crayola, yeah, markers, or then like the Mr. Sketch, like the ones that are scented,
Uh-huh.
um, are usually like favorite markers. Yeah.
I remember when I was a kid, I used to love pens. I used to love pencils. I used to love the different types of surfaces that the pencil or the pen was made out of. I liked the point of the pen. I liked the differences in how things write. I liked the just the whole experience. Certain pens had better experiences for me.
Yeah.
So when I heard that you collect markers, I get it. Like I understand like the affinity towards it. As an object, they're very interesting because they're so different, and we look at them as something that we just write a check for, or day to day type of operation stuff. But I guess I might be being a little too new agey about it because it does come down to a utility aspect of it. But there's also like something about having a good pen in your hand when you're writing something. You kind of have a little spark, or at least I have a spark that comes out
Definitely.
of certain ones over other ones.
Definitely. I think, as you say, through the ages, people are always like, like people always had, oh, this is my pen. And then
Right.
now people don't have the pen and it's like, oh, this is my tools. Then now people, I think designers will look fondly as like, oh, this was my like Iomega zip drive and this was my first Mac. Like, you always appreciate your tools and how far you've come, or you have this look on, the things that you're nostalgic for
Yeah.
in creating some of your earliest works. But I think, yeah, I think for that way, even if I don't use markers, I haven't used markers to make something in a while, I'll still always appreciate, that you say it's like a through line of just creation, I
Uh-huh.
guess, or what the marker can be used for. Um, if it's just writing down your ideas, or writing down like song lyrics or something. I think,
Hmm.
sometimes you'll see, um, yeah, like historical significance or importance of the actual marker that was used. Like somebody from, I'm getting I think I'm getting the credit wrong, but somebody reached out to me and they were doing a research paper on Alexander Girard. And they had this like black and white photo of a marker. And they were like, out of chance, do you know what this marker is? And I was kind of like, well, how am I gonna know what kind of? And then as soon as I opened up the attachment, I'm like, yeah, I think this and this and this.
You
So
did know.
with a bit of, you see a silhouette, and then you're
Yeah.
just like, okay, I think I know what this is, and you see, you know, I saw it and I was like, I think this is an action marker. They were produced, you do a little more research. You're like, they were produced in New Jersey at the time he was working in New York. Like, it's usually a textile marker, like action marker made Dalo, and then Gerard was doing textiles. So you put all these pieces together, and sometimes you're just amazed. It's like, Gerard is like, a master of graphics, but it was just interesting that this curator was reaching out and being like, but what is he using? And I think sometimes when people reverse engineer, I think there's a lot of artists that, they're like, how is this person making this? Or
Mm-hmm.
what are they using? And, you can know and still be like, well, there's part of it that's the tool, but then there's part of it that's obviously the artist and the artist's hand and the artist's mind
Mm-hmm.
doing whatever you do to use that marker. You give
Mm-hmm.
like a marker, the same marker to 50 people, everyone's going to do something different. But I still think it's, you say it's just interesting. Yeah, as a symbol of things. I think like even through like my collecting of markers, like I'll look at, the Beastie Boys, Check Your Head that Eric Hayes did for it. I'll look at it and I'll be like, what marker did he use?
Right.
You're trying to, it's important to
Yeah.
me, I'm just kind of like, wow, like apart from, the act of creation, sometimes you just like to know, you're like, what is he using? Or what is that person like, making something with?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's just kind of like neat in some ways.
Yeah.
Like
Also, the
it's
tool
not
can.
just like a number game. Yeah, it's not just like, hey, I'm just collecting markers. Not to say like baseball card collectors or it's I think it's not really attached to money. Perhaps that's one of the things that, not to say like pure or impure. Like if you want to collect whatever you want to collect, that's great. But there's it's not value driven. I don't think it's necessarily commodity like that. So for me, it's more like, well, we're all artists and creatives, and I think when you're saying like, yeah, there's the nostalgia for when we were kids. Everyone kind of understands like crayons, markers, like stationery, like Trapper Keeper, your binder. Like there is that pride. I think when we were kids, like that was our earliest. Strangely, it's just like status symbols at a certain point in time. You're like, oh, you have the Bic 3-in-1 pen versus like, oh man, I don't have, I just have this other pen. Yeah, it's kind of a weird way to just like, you know, be like, oh wow, like you could do your back to school shopping, and you'd be like, wow, this is the certain marker that I'm getting, and then this is the pencil case, and all that sort of thing. You decorate it, so perhaps it's a carryover of that. But yeah, no, like, it's interesting. Like when I talk to you, it's like, just that idea of just like marker as a tool. Like I know a lot of people will be like, the laptop is their tool, and they'll be like, oh, I'm going to
Right.
sticker it like you sticker a skateboard. It's just like
Yes.
the funny sort of connections of just like, this is my thing, and I'm going to make, whether it's a case or something, or it's like, this is the vein. People appreciate that. I think, yeah, probably does date back to like, well, this is my pencil case. I'm going to take my liquid paper and decorate, or draw on it. Yeah.
Where'd you grow up?
Toronto, Canada.
Is that where
Like
you
a
are now?
Yeah, Toronto. Yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
So, do they have good stationery stores in the city still?
There's one called Squibs, and it's been there since 1920s. It's a bit like 20 minutes. It's in a town called Weston, and I only visited maybe in 2016. Um, but they had stuff. Yeah. But
Were
I
they
think for
around when you were a student, like when you were growing up in
no, like
school?
yeah, it wasn't like my neighborhood stationery store at all. I think um yeah, there'd be certain times where I'd actually just put in research and be like, okay, I'm gonna drive to this store and see if they have old things.
Yeah.
And yeah. So I think there was never really one like independent. Well, actually, there was this guy Daniel's Art Supplies, and he had an art store in Chinatown, and he had all these old markers. But I think when I was younger and I would go in there, he, when you're young and you wear baggy pants, and I think you just give off a vibe of like, hey, like you're gonna do something funny. So I was never able to uh like crack him or like make friends with him. But I maybe like say like 7 years ago or 8 years ago, you're just a bit like, okay, like now I present better. And yeah, he'd moved his store, and I was like, hey, you still have old markers? He's like, yes, I have old markers. And I'm like, can I rummage through every single, aspect of your shop to find certain things? And he's like, yes, you can. And I'm like, I would have never been able to have done it, when I was like 16 or 17, just because he's like, what are you doing here? Like, get out of here.
Why? What was wrong with your steez back then? Baggy pants? What?
I think, yeah, I don't know. I think that's the, I've talked about this with Daniel, and I'm like, hey, I used to come in here as a teenager, and you would just never give me like the time of day, or I'd ask to see something, and he was just like, oh yeah, I think I just like, you just look like
Some
a
punk
kid that
kid.
is, yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So I'm like, oh, okay, um, yeah. So I was just like, well, I think sometimes I think like, yeah, maybe adult shopkeepers only want to deal with you when you're an adult and you're like, I would need XYZ. Like they
Right.
don't have somebody be like, do you have any old stuff in the stock room or
Right.
anything in the basement? But yeah, I think, like I said, as I've gotten older, that is one of the neat things about collecting. And I'm sure every single collector will tell you these sort of things. It's like what you see ground level is like cool. And then you're like, oh, what's the mystery, or how do you unlock like the basement? Or just being able to dig around everywhere. And you know, it is interesting. I think on that level, you can talk to any collector and be like, how'd you get into the basement? How'd you get into the stock room? And
Right.
sometimes it's just like finding that personal connection, or finding that sort of similarity, or kind of being like, hey, I appreciate what you do. And then other times, it's just an uncrackable,
Yeah.
you know,
You can't come
curmudgeonly
in too
person.
hot. You can't.
Yeah,
You can't
yeah,
come in. You got to play. A lot of times, like the long game is the best sort of game.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think definitely long game, and then there's certain people that you're just like never gonna crack
Right.
because
Who
you're
are
like,
those people for you?
okay, so in there's a lady in Bangkok that she had like stuff from like the 50s and 60s and 70s, and I think she changed her shop to like more of like gift bags and like, sort of bulk or wholesale. And I remember going in, and I'm like, okay, there's just a bunch of bags, but then I would move some things, and I'm like, oh, you have stuff from the 50s, and I want it. So you'd kind of be like, can I buy that? And then she's like, no, we only sell bags. And you're like, well, if you're not willing to sell something that you've had from the 50s to somebody, like a shop owner will either be like, yes, look at everything I have. I've had this stuff forever. Like, give me some money for it. Or like, no, mm, for whatever reason. And then there's someone in Japan, I think, unfortunately, I think he was a hoarder. It was like there's only two stationery stores that like they just didn't want to sell. And the first guy had like a lot of stuff, things that I'd never seen before, and I'd made an entire pile. Like for the first half hour, I was in there by myself making the pile. And usually generally, like I'm like, okay, an owner will come out and you're just happy to give them, your money and be like, wow, I found these old things. And usually they're like, wow, that's very old. Like, thank you for coming in. But this guy was just like, no, this is all my stuff. And like, you can't be taking this from me. And, oh, I don't care about your money. And you're just like, okay, well, at that point, kind of just like, well, it's only stuff. Like as much as like there were things in there that I would have loved to have in my collection. I'm like, well, you can't really do anything about somebody that doesn't want to sell to you. But yeah, I think for the most part, everybody has been receptive, as an original store owner, of clearing out their things. Um, and if you say you're passionate about something, sometimes they're like, wow,
Right.
it's cool that you're getting it or you're having it. Yeah,
So
yeah.
you encounter pens and markers from the 50s? Anything earlier than then?
Um,
Do they have ink in them, or are they all dried up? Are they really well preserved?
I think there's certain things that are like, I always just say like 50s as an early one, because I think there's like a lot of these glass bottle markers. Like I know there was like one place in Bangkok where I saw like original pilot markers. Usually when there's like a glass bottle marker, it's like a small stubby one.
What glass bottle is that? Like an inkwell on the pen? Is that what you mean?
Uh, it's like the canister is glass.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like these are kind of, so it'll be like under there that like that's a glass bottle. Like some of the
Right.
earliest markers were like
Oh, yes. Okay. Oh, cool. Oh, cool. Nice. Oh,
yeah.
okay, cool.
So usually they're stubby, but then I saw these like ones in Bangkok and like they were just normal, like sort of fat size, like maybe like this, and they
That's
were
what
made
I'm
out of,
thinking of when
and
you're
they were
talking
made out
about
of,
markers.
those were made out of glass, and I was like, whoa, like if they were making things out of glass, I think those are very like early, like to me, earliest examples
Yeah.
of markers. Perhaps, and then I think that it's funny because it's like I think when you collect, you not to say you make up stories, but I think like anybody just to try to make examples. I'm like, maybe in the 40s they were rationing for the war, so things were made out of glass rather than metal. So yeah, I don't know. That's the sort of logic that I had, where it's like, oh, if you're finding glass markers, it's going to be, like pretty old.
Are you geared more towards finding the older ones or the less produced ones?
There's like other things where it's like antiques, or there's a very like a great like something to reference. I don't really have a reference
Right.
point where it's like people say you collect what you collect. I think naturally I'm drawn to older items just for aesthetic and difference. And I don't know particularly what might be super rare other than like, oh, I've never seen this before and I've looked at a lot of places. So I think there's obviously a joy in finding something you've never seen before, but there's a difference between like, oh, I've never seen this dollar store marker made in 2000s versus like, oh, I've never seen this like 1950s um, version of this pilot marker that I've
Mm-hmm.
seen. Like, there's this marker that is so there's like a simple like Pentel like white like marker, and I think a lot of people have seen like the super updated versions, but like this one has like, oh, this is the different font, and then there's like the different like there's like little bits where you know I'm not like, eureka, I found a dinosaur. Like this is an amazing, but I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting to me.
Right.
That I found like an earlier version of something. There's obviously categories and subcategories. So there's things where I'm like, yes, I love finding vintage, but then there'll be certain things where I'm like, I love finding like bootleg versions of something. So even that'll be a subcategory where
Yeah.
you're like, yeah, like a zebra McKee is probably one of the most like bootlegged, markers. And sometimes for me, I'm like, it's a funnier other challenge to be like, I'm going to go to all the dollar stores in Chinatown and see how many different funny variations of this one marker there are. So it can range. It's like, you know, as enamored as I am about finding vintage, sometimes I like finding, bootlegs, or sometimes there's like branded markers, like Campbell's Soup Company
Uh-huh.
made markers, Pan Am made markers, um, just certain ones that are, a bit different. Um, so yeah, I think, like I said, I think sometimes it becomes a numbers thing for me, where I'm like, well, I am collecting black markers. Like I do have to pick this up,
Yeah.
even if I have no, personal attachment, or like, oh wow, like this is a really cool marker. But then yeah, there are other ones where I'm like, wow, this is really like special or different or unique. Um, there's one marker, like some stuff is like regional, or there's like a company called like Jiffy Marker, and it was a Canadian, they're the Canadian distributor of Artline. So I think sometimes you'll be like, oh wow, like when you say like rarity or decades, sometimes it'll go geographically, where I'll be like, oh okay, these are like the Canadian markers, these are American markers, these are Japanese markers, these are heritage like Mexican markers.
Mm-hmm.
I think yeah, again, collectors will be like, oh, this is the Argentinian GI Joe, or this is the it's such a diverse, um, able to categorize and collect different things. So it is just kind of nice to see, yeah, or different things.
And there's no record, right? There's no roadmap for acquisition with markers are there? Are you pretty much peerless? Are there other
Um,
collectors in the world that
there's
do what you're doing?
definitely there's definitely collectors, and I don't think it's like peerless isn't. I know you're not using it in like, oh, hey, like peerless. I'm not. Oh yeah, like markers. It's
No,
like
I'm not implying that at all. It's actually it's cool to me. It's quite nerdy, honestly. Like you're collecting
um,
markers. It's interesting. It's different and unique.
yeah,
I just want to know if you have a hard time um being able to find stuff simply because is there a community of marker
there
collectors?
is a community of
Okay,
marker collectors. So I think like in the mid, I don't even know how to reference the decade, like 2010.
sure.
I think there'd be a lot of marker collectors that um, you kind of be pen pals with,
Right.
and then you're like, oh, like this person, like friend of mine, Marcus, would live in Germany, and you'd be like, hey, like here's all these old like Edding markers, and you would trade things. Um, sometimes people like for me, I just collect black markers mostly. Like I'll pick up everything else, but usually that's in a weird way like trade sort of material.
Yeah.
Like there'd be certain people who I'll be like, here are all my vintage like other colored markers. But if you have vintage black markers from your country, like we'll trade them. Um,
Can you tell different ink qualities with these markers or different brush qualities in these markers? Do you use every single one? I know you
yeah,
earlier I wanted to touch on this. You say you render them one to one. Part of your collection is also you draw
yeah.
a copy of a graphical representation of each marker that you have, right?
Yeah.
That's wild. I love that. And do you
So,
use the marker that you bought to make the marker rendering?
if I drew the marker, I don't
Uh-huh.
use the marker itself to draw the marker because in certain cases, like you just wouldn't be able to. Like if you have a jumbo
Yeah.
marker, you're never going to be able to get the
Right.
details.
Right.
But I would draw things like this, and then like coming up from it, I would be like, oh, now here is the like mark that it makes as a reference.
Are you showing me drawings of markers or is that a photo? Are those your drawings in that?
Yes,
That's
it's like
incredible.
in a magazine. But yeah, it's just
That's
like a
so cool.
production. So like I
Yeah.
would just have the markers and then be like, okay, take the cap off of this marker and be like, okay, make like the sample line and it'll
Right.
show the ink quality, the width, the everything. There are certain classifications where you kind of invent your own sort of grading or your own. You're like, what is the nib type?
Right.
Like bullet, chisel, and then you're like, what are the nib measurements? And then you're just like, whoa, this is kind of really getting nerdy even for me. I'm like, this is a 2 millimeter on this side, but then on this other side, it's a
Right.
5 millimeter. And then you're like, okay. And then you start getting into like people were like, you should kind of describe it like a sommelier. So being like, oh, what is the aroma of
Right.
the marker? So sometimes you'll be like, oh, it's heavy alcohol, or sometimes it's like, oh, it has a fruitiness, or
Yes.
you're
Yes.
just like,
Yes.
okay, like that's another like classification or grading scale. And then
Yo, a
sometimes,
sommelier of markers? That's incredible. Someone who would just like smell the brush. That's
yeah,
funny.
and I think there's certain things that people say like, yes, like they have xylene or they have certain things. And then
Yeah.
even in like whiteboard markers, whenever you write with them and then you see it afterwards, it'll always have a brown hue.
Uh-huh.
There's certain other ones that'll always have like a faint, like indigo, like everything Crayola always leaves like a Crayola, like an indigo hue. And I think, after a while you see the different ink properties or you'll see certain things that are mixed in with things. And yeah, I guess again, it's just about being detail oriented or spending time with all these different
Right.
markers that I have. But like, yeah, onto the marker itself through the drawing and through the cataloging and through the use of things. Especially when I was like drawing like large scale bits, I'd be like, oh, okay, like this is showing up as blue. But now that I know that if I want this effect, I'll use this blue. Or, this one will show up brown, or this one will show up like true, like black. Um, yeah, sometimes it's just again, it's a character properties of the tools you use. So it becomes this sort of like, oh, I'm using them and I need them to do this, but then it'll be like, oh, also now it's just an object that I'm collecting, or then
Hmm.
like, oh wow, this is a great example of you know um, like typography or certain design
Hmm.
characteristic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, like just like some random like nerdy stuff like you learn. It's like there's like an Avery marker. Then the Avery logo is designed by, I feel like, Saul Bass. And you're like, oh wow, that's really cool. There's just these intersection of like design, graphic design, um, art stuff
Mm-hmm.
that I do, that it all interests me.
Yeah, which is something I also wanted to get into, the graphic design of the pen itself, and you just answered the
Yeah.
question. Um, that does matter, and it's fascinating to learn that you're even aware of the graphic designer who designed the logo on the pen. That's
In
impressive too.
some cases, like I think that I would, when I have time, sometimes I'd be like, okay, like you do a bit of more of a deep dive of like, okay, where was the original factory? And then who was, and in researching that, people, you know, the information will come up and you're just like, oh, wow, like
Mhm.
here's another sort of, interesting thing about this marker. But yeah, I think, any sort of type person or any sort of graphic designer like that just appreciates just like, like font or like
Mhm.
different like construction of bits and even
Mhm.
just the way how like certain color combinations go or even like little icons like this seagull
Yeah.
of this like, marker. I think, I'll look at that stuff and be like, oh wow, that's really interesting. I think it's just certain characteristics of certain markers you see, even just the construction aspect. So sometimes it'll jump from, like the type isn't like really cool, but the actual object,
Yes. Right.
itself of like the cap, and then like this really like nice nib, and just the overall construction of things. I
Yeah.
think, things appeal to you in different ways as like a designer, and being like, oh wow, this is just like one piece like all the way through. It's not like a screw off, like this is one entire molded piece and then that comes off. I think, um, you know there's a lot to appreciate within each marker and marker variants, and whether it's a combination of, as you say, branding, logos, typography, actual construction, and then yeah, just historic, I guess.
Yeah. I'm looking at when you were just showing me all that different stuff. I had this overwhelming urge to ask, like, what when you see all the pens together, what's the story that's unfolding here? And the word that kept coming into my brain is this is a historical document. Is it a historical document of workmanship, penmanship? Is it a historical document of commerce? Like, the pen is such, it has so many different, you can you can have so many different meanings involved in it. But I imagine when you see your collection in mass, when you see it all at once, there must be something else that you're also discovering yourself. Can you touch upon that at all and help me out here? Because I'm being so like, it's on the tip of my tongue of like what I'm trying to figure out,
I
because
think
there's so many things that are coming at me when I'm looking at these different pens already, and I'm just seeing a few. When you see them all together, what do you feel?
I would have to say, when you say like, oh, you don't want to sound new agey, I think like it really is, it's the documentation of tools that human beings use. Like, sometimes when you like people that collect old hardware stuff, sometimes you'll just be like hammer, 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 level, 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 and you'll pick it up and be like, this was used to build this person's house. Like there's a story, there's attachment, there's, to go back to your point about like, is there, animus about certain objects?
Mhm.
I think there's, yeah, like if you did an archaeological dig and be like, oh wow, here's pieces of pottery that people stored food in, I think it is just very, as you say, utilitarian items, but these are items that, perhaps people use to do plans for, the Eiffel Tower or
Mhm.
something,
Mhm.
or kind of like, hey, as a fashion person, it's like, hey, I did all the sort of like early bits for, whatever fashion brand from the 60s, and this was the DNA of something. I think, yeah, for markers, it's just maybe the unifying thing is just like the act of creation.
Mhm.
And you just say it's just like as a tool. Like I think, sometimes like when we were kids, it's like we just collect like rusty nails or something. It's just like that object that you kind of are like, ah, this is a symbol of, you know, combination of we were here plus, this is the foundation of perhaps whatever came next. And, like it's, you can see, work, you can see all, amazing things. But I think if you were to see like, oh, wow, these are like Michelangelo's brushes, like there's a romanticism about like, oh,
Sure.
wow, this is the actual brush. But if you just saw, and I think, yeah, in other terms, like sometimes you're just, yeah, when you see people's, yeah, people are enamored, I think, by the tools of what people use.
Yes.
So, yeah, perhaps the through line of a lot of these things is, just I guess as object, but then yeah, as variances of things.
Yeah. I could
Um,
say off the bat, bringing back, going back, circling back to your Hayes comment, like to have the marker that he used to draw out the check your head
yeah,
logos and fonts would be a cool object to have. Don't you agree?
100%. I think
Yeah.
there's a certain like even like I say, there's this like all these sort of yeah, there's all these sort of pictures of artists throughout history, and you'll see them with something, and people are like, "What is that? What are they using?"
Right.
Uh, and I think it's that intersection of there's like a lot of graffiti writers that are a member of the marker community and are like, this is what I use, and this is what I did my first tag with, and this is
Yeah.
they're very a combination again of historian and like keepers of tradition. And there's that segment, there's people that are just all sorts of through all different walks of life of just like this unifying thing of like, well, you know here's this thing, this is what I use it for, this is what I remember using it for. um yeah, kind of got, yeah.
Um Also there's an aspect of it's something that isn't really supposed to be collected. I had a guest on that collects Pyrex, and
Okay, yeah,
a
I
big
saw
part
that
of
one. It was
a
a really
big
good
part
interview.
Go
Yeah,
ahead. Say again.
a really good interview. I like that one. Yeah, the
Oh
look for
yeah, no, she was great, but a big part of, thank you for listening to that. But a big part of her fascination with it was that it was Pyrex are things that served a function,
hmm
and they've become a kind of collector's item. And that struck me as so interesting. And I have the same feeling with your pen collection, which is so impressive to me. It's so unique and so cool. Is that these are all things that weren't supposed to be um admired. These are all things that aren't supposed to be admired. They're supposed to have a function and a form. Now, with every design, I understand there's an elegance involved in creating it, but it's so interesting to see things that aren't supposed to be collected together. And I think that's also where the magic comes in when you look at all of your markers and when you look at the little details of it, is that they're really the result of efficiency.
Yes, I think like the closest sort of if there was like a cousin of marker collecting, it is like vintage spray paint can collecting.
Yes.
If somebody's job is like, well, we got to sell this paint, and here's again a combination of like all these vintages cans, and then the label design, and then the sort of emotional connection that people had to be using them. And it's like, hey, some people may continue to make amazing work with spray cans, but I think again you see these objects and you're just like, wow, like they were just meant to be like, hey, just spray your deck, or like paint your bike or something.
Right. And then throw it away.
Yes, and then throw it away, and then it becomes this like series or something to kind of like um yeah, collect. And I think yeah, when people say, you're just like, yeah, finding what you like to collect that's meaningful for you. I guess that's why it's like collecting cans is a good cousin to what I do. It's like a lot of like writers will be like, yes, we have like the biggest collection of cans. There's
Right.
these collectors, Cap Matches Color Collective, and I think they have probably North America's largest collection of vintage spray paint cans. And sometimes they'll trade messages, and they're like, yes, they go around East Coast and just go to old hardware stores and clear places out. And very similar to what I do, it's like they're fans of, as you say, the design, the graphics, the aspects of things, and the connection to, you know, their own personal craft or their own personal history of creating images and artwork with 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 the material. Um, so yeah, I think, yeah, perhaps there is, you know, I think the more people, you know, you talk to their collections about, I still think sometimes are just very like, yeah, it's really neat to see that, as you say, the connections and the through lines, especially with the Pyrex, because even in that aspect, you know, I'm like, the more you get out there, you're just like, okay, like if you see it and it's marked with Pyrex, and then there's even in that, people will be like, I only collect the Jade series, or I only
Yes.
collect books. And like, you know, my friend Warren will be like, here's the C like handle, and here's the D handle, and this is the difference. And, you know, I think like we, any collector just appreciates that further knowledge or the further sorting. And, you know, there's all these certain characteristics where you're like, look for this and look for that, and this is how you'll know. And it is, as you say, it's just like a, yeah, it's like I say, it's a weird one. It's like I know I have an active collection, but I don't necessarily, you know, a lot of times people will be like, are you obsessed with markers? And I'm like, kind of, but not like in spurts. It's like, you know, I'll be like, oh yes, here's this part of, you know, that I like doing, but not like every single day. I'm like, markers, 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 markers. Like, I need to find these markers. Like, you know, like what's the valuation of markers? What's, you know, like, oh, how can I find more markers?
Yeah.
Um, I know, you know, like I would sometimes get markers on eBay, but I think not to say it, you know, at some point in time, you just have to go on sites like that because you're not going to find things in the wild. But, you know, I prefer to find things in person. I'm sure if, you know, I was dedicated to finding, you know, going online, I'd probably get more
Hmm.
vintage markers. And like I said, it's just like when you're your own person, it's like, yes, I like collecting markers, but I don't necessarily have to, you know, yeah, like I don't always have to just be like, oh my gosh, I need to say like get 20 new markers this month, or like, oh, like wow, like it's time's a ticking. I really need to be doing this. I think
Right.
part of it is like when I first started collecting, it was like I'm a numbers person, I think. Whenever there's certain things where I'm like, okay, here's 25, here's 50, here's 100, here's 250, here's 500. I think as soon as I broke 1,000 markers, I was kind of like, oh, I don't need, perhaps there's like less pressure. It's like, well, what's the next number that I'm
Right.
going to get? So after that, like there's a little less pressure to um, perhaps acquire. Like I think I remember when I was at like 750, I'm like, okay, you know what, like let's just keep on getting some markers. So they're not going to be like amazing again, like some of them are like, here's this dollar store marker. Or I would go on to um like certain marker sites, like industrial markers, and be like,
Huh?
okay, I'm ordering 15 different markers just to get like, you know, the numbers up, numbers up, numbers up. But then as soon as I hit 1,000, I'm like, okay, I can kind of rest. And you know, that was probably 2014. So I haven't, you know, been actively, you know, super collecting, but I will always look for new bits.
What
Uh,
sparked it? What clicked where you're like, I'm a markers guy. I'm gonna not. I mean, it's. I want to get to where how you started your artistic journey, but when did you add on marker collector to your repertoire? Like, when was like the click of I want to collect these. I don't just want to use them. I want to actually document them and amass them. When did that happen?
like 2002, 2003, I lived in London, UK, and I was just drawing these big Chinatowns series. Like that's another thing that I'm into, is like documenting Chinatowns around the world. And again, I would just like sit in Chinatown and do these sketches and drawings, and then I'd make these larger scale works. So, you know, I keep my markers in a shoebox. I used to work at a sneaker store in Portobello Market. You know, so I'd always have these like shoe boxes, and I'd be like, okay, like these are the 5 markers that I use. You know, most of them were from the stock room. There was like an Impega, there was like a Gilbert, there was this other marker from um, the markets, and then some some pound shop markers, and I'd be like, okay, here's 6 or 7 markers in a shoebox, and then I'm like, I think I started like looking at them and being like, okay, I'm gonna separate the individual ones, and then start trying to find new ones. So, I would go to like older stationery stores in Portobello, and I'd find these old like little magic marker bits and being like, oh, okay, like in addition to finding all the new ones, like I would go to like just like the general art stores and be like, okay, here's like this black marker. I'm like, okay, fine, I'm buying it, I'm buying it, I'm buying it. But then when I started going to the old stationery stores, and I'm like, oh, there's a vintage aspect to this
Right.
market collecting, and you're like, oh, okay. Um, and again, it's like around 25, and I'm like, okay, like this is quite manageable, still fits in a shoebox. It's
Right.
what I like. I'm drawing, like this is what I'm into. Like it's cheap. Like there's no, pressure. Nobody's like, oh my gosh, like where are you finding these markers? I'm like, I'm going for a walk
Right.
and pop my head in the store. Um, but then, I remember going to like Paris for Chinese New Year and being like, oh, let me see if there's some markers here, and
Uh-huh.
then you're like, oh, like Bic is really popular here. And then you find the variations of that. And then you start, I think that kind of clicked that I'm like, from 25 markers to 50 markers. I was like, oh, okay. I think between the traveling and the using it for the work that I was making, I think I started just conscientiously being like, okay, like markers are probably my thing. It's a very low, I'm just as like, yeah. I think like at the time, I always say this, like at the time, like everybody was collecting like, sneakers and records and
Uh-huh.
vinyl plastic toys. And I think part of, you know, yeah, part of having a collection is obviously like, flexing on other collectors and people being like, oh, wow, like, did you get this? Do you have this?
Yes.
And I'd be like, I don't have like money for that, but I can, have a bunch of markers,
Yeah.
and I think I can quietly like amass, some numbers on this, and it'll just keep me again, like because it's like if you don't have money to go out, you're just like, well, I guess I'll just collect these markers and then draw some of these markers, and that'll be what I do in my spare time. So yeah, just from 2002 onwards, I think it just again like it's like you hit the 50 mark, you hit the 100 mark, you hit the whatever other mark, and then whenever I would just continue to travel or like just be in different cities, I'd be like, okay, let's spend a day, you know, um, actively, trying to look at stores that would have markers.
And you
Like,
just went on a big trip, right? You were telling me in our initial emails that you were just on a trip to Japan. Was it Japan only?
yeah, just
Stationary
Japan.
stores?
Yeah.
Wow. Can you talk a little bit? You mentioned it earlier. You mentioned it here and there, but can you talk about this last trip that you went on? I think it's so cool to have a endeavor that takes you places.
I would do the North American cities, and go to New York and be like, okay, like, what are the old stationery stores? You go visit them all. There's probably maybe, only one um, still left. But once you clear out, all those aspects, you're like, oh, well, now where can I go? So I remember like, you know, going to old spots in LA and going to old spots in New York and going to old spots, Hong Kong for work, Shanghai for work. And, uh, went to Japan in 2019, and I was kind of, I'm like, oh, I'll pop my head into some stationery stores, some old stationery stores, made a Google map and be like, okay, well, I want to see certain like cities, but like while I'm there, I might as well like look at
Mhm.
some stationery stores.
Yeah.
But this recent trip, like I went from for a month from October like 21st to November 22nd, and starting in January, I just like planned out, on Google Maps. It's quite easy to do. You just kind of go city to city or train stop to train stop, and then I would look for old stationery stores, and you put the little man on the street, and you kind of look at the angles, and you kind of see like the signage or see if you can look inside a window. And then I think you read Google comments and sometimes people will be like, I've been going here since I was a kid, or this is a very old store. So I'd make this like pin it, and I'd make this spreadsheet. And I think was pretty much what I was doing, when I wasn't working. I think part of it was like, when we're able to travel, like this will be my reward for like saving money and just working diligently and not thinking about anything. So when I went to Japan, I think I was just like, you know what? I think I'm just going like city to city, and I'm going to visit these old stationery stores. And, I have a list of 75, but if I can visit 50 of them, um, it's just something I wanted to do while they're still open.
Mm-hmm.
I think I knew from 2019 up until this year, 2022, like a lot of things were already closing because people were getting older. And then I think that was the final sort of thing of COVID, of places just shuttering for good. And I think, I was really motivated by that and being like, okay, there's old stationery stores in Japan. I want to try to visit as many of them as I can and see what there is from a collector standpoint, but also just from, a people standpoint. You want to see the physical space. You want to see just that idea. I think, again, the closest thing that is similar to in North America is like the old hardware store,
Mm-hmm.
like it's very rare to still see a mom and pop or an independent one that hasn't changed. And when you go in there, as you say, it's just like you'll find items that you'll never find before. And it's this, just different experience. So that's pretty much what I did. I started in Onamichi, which is pretty much halfway across Japan. And I would just take the train, and I would just go from stop to stop and station to station. And I would have a hit list of like, 5 or 7 stationery stores a day to visit. And I would just do the list, and keep the itinerary and go. And then there's certain ones where, I'd spend hours in just digging through everything. And then there was some that would just be like, oh, this is closed for good. And you're like, oh, that sucks. And then you just like, again, just follow the planning and go from store to store. But it's just a really nice, amazing experience of being able to see firsthand shops,
Yes.
stationery shops, owners. Again, like some of them will be like, I was the original owner. Some of it would be like, oh, I'm the son. Some of it would be like, oh, we're the daughters. Some of it would be like, oh, I'm the original owner. Some of it would be like, oh, my, grandfather's grandfather started it. So again, you start getting into like history, you start getting into like family dynamics, you start getting into just like personal stories. So, if there's a story in every marker, of course, there's going to be a story in every single store. There's going to be a story of every environment in every single family. And I thought that was just a really special sort of nice little thing to do while I was like, digging or collecting.
It's a cool way to see a locale. What do these shop owners make of you when you walk in?
Just sometimes you have no idea what people like think. You're just as
Sure.
like, oh, like I don't know. But I had this. I guess I'll like show it. Yeah, I'll have like a reference of it. I printed out this piece of paper, and it's basically like, hello, my name is Allister. I'm visiting from Toronto, Canada. I collect, black markers and old stationery, and if you'd be kind enough to let me see some things. So I think that was like very like a good way to break the ice of like, hey, I'm not just like wandering in to see like just your shop, just or
Right.
whatever pace it would be. I think I would, and I would genuinely mean it. I'd be like, wow, this is a beautiful store. Like a lot of times you'd be like, I'd go into a store and you'd see the way like a display case was made or the walls were made, and you're like, oh, your grandpa made this, didn't he? He's like, yes. And then as soon as you kind of acknowledge that to them, they are like, oh, okay, like you're not just trying to buy, some copy paper. I
Right.
think you're here to kind of experience or kind of like know our story a bit more. And yeah, I think no, I just try to be like genuine and kind of, when you sit with people, I think there's the commonality and just being like, wow, I would just generally acknowledge them like, wow, this is a really great space, and I think this is really cool, and I think they have that tradition of you know whatever your family started, now you inherit it, and now you're doing things. And I think sometimes maybe they're like, I'm stuck. Sometimes people say like, oh, now I'm stuck in this business, or like, oh yes, like I don't know. I think like every single owner probably had a different interaction, because obviously people just have different reactions. But for the most part, there's just some really special ones where you're just like, wow, like I don't even know how all this stuff from the 50s and 60s ever, like like why why people haven't like found or like visited or like come to your store before. And I think like some of the interactions, like I found these old like you know Arsenal soccer like
Uh-huh.
bag, and I think it's 1962. I did a bit of research. It's based on their uniform and their kit. You're just like, why is this here?
Yeah.
I find all these like old swimming bags from like all these like Showa era
That's cool.
animation bits, and being like, okay, like you have all this amazing stuff. So I think there were certain ones. Yeah, there was definitely certain stores where you would go in. Like there was one store I went to, and it was really nice. It's like I saw this old marker drawing on the cash wrap, on the front of the cash wrap, and I was like, oh my gosh, the kid drew Godzilla, and I'm just like, it just clicks with me, where I'm like, oh wow, I'm in Japan, and in the early 80s, the son of this really old couple with a stationery store was raised in the stationery store. He got out the marker and he drew this Godzilla, and I was like, that is amazing for me.
Yeah.
You so yeah, I think there's, like I said, there's like a lot of like interesting moments, and I think, yeah, as much as I was planned, and the trip, I think, yeah, there's certain times where I just spend like hours with people and then just try to ask them questions about things, and at that point they're like, okay, well, come back here. I'm like, hey, look at this, or here, look at this like family, like the photo album, and then they'll tell you, like story of things. I think that's the one thing that I always, sure, it's like feel bad for myself, but it's like when I don't know the language, you can only get surface level a lot of the
Sure.
times. And I am generally interested in a lot of, I'm just genuinely interested in hearing people's stories. So I think, yeah, historically, whenever I've gone to different countries, it's very transactional of like, well, hello, like I want to buy these markers. And then part of me is like, well, I know, there's a bigger like story, and I'd love to be able to speak in your language and know what it is. And I think, that's, yeah, that's just been another part of, you know, collecting. It's like the
And
item.
those stories are so interesting, and your take on it is so profound, because it's not like you're going into some former specialty shop where only a certain type of person would come in. I mean, there are those that keep diaries and journals that you find, but stationery shops, like everybody needs a pen. Everybody needed to write a letter at one point before emails came around. And even now people write letters and cards and stuff. Pens, everybody needs a pen. So you're telling of wanting to hear all of the stories that have come out of that shop. It has a real sentimental value to it because it's such a wide net of people. It's not just a specialized collector that you're hearing stories about. You're hearing a real tale of the neighborhood that the that the store is in, the town or city that the store is in, and kind of like a wider net of society around that area, because like everybody pens, everybody needs a pen in their house.
Yeah. I think, as you say, it's just like, again, I think with stationery stores in particular in that culture, and then I'm sure it used to be, North American culture. It's like, that's where you go when you're a kid,
Mm-hmm.
school, and you get your school supplies,
Mm-hmm.
or like the Walmarts and everything, or just buying things online. And you do
Mm-hmm.
have an attachment to those, like local stores. And I think, yeah, it's, obviously things change, but I think
Yeah.
there are a lot of the things, like just the way that society is built. It's like there'll be like a school, and then the stationery store has been doing business with the school for like
Hmm.
generations and generations.
Right.
And like when you go there, you get a list and you're like, you can only buy things from this stationery store. So you're like, oh, that's like different. That doesn't exist, over here.
Yeah.
So sometimes, you'll just like hear how, that's just even interwoven into their general society of, you know, when people will be like, yes, like my kids used to come here, or I was here as a kid and now my kid is coming here. Again, it's, the closest thing in North America that people have for that is the hardware store.
Yes, and that's a good point.
Yeah.
My clunky uh diatribe was kind of trying to differentiate the stationery store from, like, say, the clientele of a model train store, where it's
Okay.
very specialized as in who
Okay.
comes in there.
I
I
see what you're
feel
saying.
like with a stationery store, you have a wider net of personalities walking in and out of that place.
If you went into an old comic book store, of course they know the value of their things.
Right.
You're dealing with a different owner, you're dealing with a different personality. They are very like, like you are coming to me and I know, and I have this encyclopedic sort of knowledge, and I'm just like, oh, don't bother me. Just like, who knows? I'm
There's a
sure everyone does.
transactional understanding. There's almost an agreement that you're making when you walk into that shop,
Yeah.
that you are looking to acquire. If you're walking into a comic book shop in particular, you're looking to acquire something that's hopefully going to appreciate in value over time. That's
Yes.
different from a stationery store where, like, that was another question that I was going to ask you. Like, how do they even know what to charge you for some of this stuff?
What is amazing, amazing, and like just like they honor like how everything, all the packaging was like they would always write the price on the box, like so I think what's common is it's like they'll always, that is like an over sticker, but it'll
Uh
just
huh.
say like, 150 yen. But I think even on early like markers, they would write, yeah, they usually like write it right on the barrel of like what it would be. But sometimes like a lot of the owners, like they just honor that original price.
Nice.
So you'll be like, oh, here's like a 1975 marker and it says 100 yen. And they'll look at it and be like, oh, well, it says 100 yen. And you're like, oh, okay.
Right.
So that was, again, like a nice, again, like that's what makes, I think, Japan very attractive is like as a collector, because a lot of the times the things that they see as old, I think, again, if you went into a comic book store, people would be like, oh, that is old. I'm gonna set this price. But there,
Yes.
they're like, again, as a utilitarian item, they're like, okay, well, this has been sitting here since the 70s. It's like I'd be happy to get the 150 yen for it. There's a lot of cases where they if something is old and not working, they're almost like, I can't sell this to you in good faith because it doesn't work like it's supposed to. And in those instances, like there's a lot of things that some of the owners just give to me for free. And I think sometimes I would feel, indebted and awkward, but it's like, I went into one stationery store and, this nice gentleman like just gave me this old set of
Wow.
bottle, early 70s, like late 60s, like the Sakura markers. And he'd test them, they open them up, they test every single one, and he's just like, yeah, like, I don't know if you want to buy these, like, they don't work. And I'm like, oh no. And then you explain to them I'm a collector, and then they're just like, here, this is a present for you then.
Amazing.
I was just like, wow. So I think there's a lot of times where I'm like, I'm finding something really rare that in my head I'd be like, I paid $30 for that. Yes. They give it to you for free. And then part of you is just like, well, I don't want to like, not to say like waste money, but I'm like, how do I spend now $30 at their store
Sure.
on something else? So I think there are scenarios like that where I would buy something that is maybe I wouldn't have bought before, or I will just try to like even it out. So sometimes, you just have to accept a present and be like, well, I don't want to just buy random stuff that I'm not going to use or throw out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that aspect of collecting was just like, again, just super amazing when the price is the price, and there is not that, extra bit, as you say, of like if you went into a specialty store,
Mm-hmm.
know that there's an online guide, as you
Mm-hmm.
say, to like records or baseball cards or comic book cards, that if somebody is retailing them to you, they will always reference something and be like, okay, you know what? Here's the number.
Yeah, there's no like market value associated with what you're doing.
No, and like I say, if anything, I think the mentality with there was just like, this stuff has been sitting here sometimes since the 70s, and if you want to buy it, and it's not working, or you're interested in it, like they'll always be like, hey, it was originally like 2,000 yen, but for you, I'll make it 1,000. And you're like,
Yeah.
cool, and I think it just made everything, like I said, it's like a joy, um, and a really nice experience to be like, okay, well, I'm going to visit all these stores, and if I can put money into people's hands, I'm just
Mhm.
happy to go and be there. But when you get something, I feel, as a present or be acknowledged, you're kind of like, oh, maybe that is nice that I'm getting rewarded for either having a passion or persistence or caring about, someone's store or someone's shop. So yeah, it has been really nice. As an aside, I remember, like, there was one store I visited in 2019 that was kind of an old stationery store. He didn't really have anything for sale. His shop was more of it's kind of just like an archive. But I remember that was like my favorite stationery store that I visited. It's called Tsuyama. It's just like outside of Tokyo, and that kind of like left this sort of impression on me that I'm like, oh, like I think there are going to be, you know, within 50 stores, there might be like 5 or 10 really, really special ones. And let's try to find those special ones. So from 2019 to this one, you know, again, like some of it is numbers, some of it is like, hey, I want to find vintage things. But I think, what you're really looking for a collector or as a human being or just somebody is like the really nice moments of special moments of like, oh yes, like I'm in a special place, having a special interaction, acquiring something for my collection. And I think then that's where it becomes like, well, what did you find there? It goes back to the original discussion we were having, where it's like, does a marker have symbolism? There'll be certain markers that I found, in a place that it's like, it's quite common. There's nothing special about it. It's not specifically rare, but I'll always attach it to like, oh, I went to, Arita, Wakayama, walked through this orange field, walked across this, big body of water in the rain to visit this guy, spent, 2 hours there, and this is what I found. Um, yeah, I say there's just different memory and experience in how you, how you acquire things in your collection. And I think, perhaps, yeah, perhaps it is a different interaction than how other collectors collect. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes when you go to like an antique place, of course you're finding like what you think you're going to find or this curated selection of thing. I think, for me, when I can, it is the best to be able to visit like the actual store.
Mm-hmm.
You say it's just like, yeah, just to be like, okay, like it's not like you're a mystery shopper, but you're just like, I'm here, don't mind me. It's just like, this is for 50 cents and $1 and $2. And I think that's what I've always appreciated about, collecting black markers. It's like, you're just an anonymous person, and there's no
Yeah.
necessarily like a value or like, like, oh, I'm flipping through rare records, or I'm flipping through something that there's like, oh, how can we angle this person? It's like, no, here's what I find. And people will be like, why do you like that? I'm like, I just collect it. And then they'll be like, oh, that's interesting. And then, yeah, they're just happy to, yeah, pass it over.
So that was remarkable. I get it. I totally understand. And some of these stationery shops must be very the energy when you walk into it must be something else too. Like you can't really describe it, but you
Well,
did a really nice job trying to articulate what you're
yeah,
that moment. Yeah, also like it brings it back to the earlier point. It does bring in people, because there are a lot of people who want a specific type of pen. They want a specific type of experience, a certain type of line that they're looking for, and that could take them to different shops. And the cross section of people that come into that shop, and the needs that are fulfilled by the owner there, have a lot to do with the stories that come out of that shop. It's a very unique environment. I'm really getting the sense of like how unique these stationery shops are, because of the notion that they're not they're not geared towards a specialty customer, but they're geared towards the kind of almost like human need.
Yes.
In a specialized way, because anybody who needs a pen, they could just go to the grocery store or whatever. But there are certain people. There is that lost art of of letter writing that was persistent for a very long time.
What is really neat is like the everyman or the anonymous person can go in and be like, hey, I'm buying these 2 markers, and that anonymous man might be Andy Warhol,
Mhm.
would go to Central Art Supply in New York and be like, oh, like, we're not going to charge him, like, I'm going to charge you $500 of those markers because of who you are or whatever. It's just like, I like the fact that like this is, again, as like, it's 100% utilitarian, cheap for everybody, for every single creator, for every single designer. You're just a person. You're all a part of this one community of people that just are like, you appreciate your tools, you appreciate your art things, you love creativity, and whatever you make with it is just this other thing. You can be a 5-year-old kid buying a pencil at one of these stationery stores, or you could be this like world-renowned artist being like, oh yeah, like there's no difference of like a kid being like, I really like this like wide crayon because it fits my hand, and I really like this color of blue, to somebody that's very particular about like, I really need this one pen that has this certain ink, that has this certain nib, that has this certain bit, and it's all yeah, it's all viable.
I remember, particularly in my case, I used to, when I was in school, I liked using the Pilot Precise pens. I was the type of kid that liked certain pens, and I would only use certain pens. Anything else I wouldn't use. So I would go out of my way to find them. I also experienced that. You mentioned graffiti writers earlier with markers. Aren't they very particular about the brush on their markers and the nib on their markers?
I think the graffiti ones are like super interesting because it's like, yeah, everyone just becomes an artist at a certain point. Apart from the culture, apart from all that sort of thing, people are just very like down to the like, this is the nib that I want to make this effect, to do this. So again, you could be a graffiti writer, you could be an architect, you could be, like a fashion designer. People at that point are just admiring what that artistic tool can do and the limitations of what that is to make what they want.
So let's see the haul from Japan. It's time to do a little show and tell here. What are your recent scores?
It's a bit of everything. Like I think on one of like the last days, I thought these were like really neat. Is like it's a old Sakura. Is this like ink 1960s like printer's ink canister?
That's cool.
That was like really neat.
And do you geek out on the font? Like, do you get really into like the printing of the fonts and stuff like that, the labels and stuff?
Yeah, it's the font, it's the label, it's the physicality of the metal. I remember like there was this old hardware store in Greenpoint, and I found this old Red Devil paint cans from like the 50s, and it just reminds me of that, where you're like, oh wow, like just the item, and I guess as you say, like the patina, like a lot of the oil from the ink is like rubbed off, and it's like saturated it, and that's kind of like interesting. Like when I went to the store, they didn't have anything old at all, and then I looked in the corner and I was like, what are those up there? He's like, oh, we can't sell them to you. And I'm like, you can't sell them to me because you're collecting them? He's like, nah, they're just like leaking and everything. And I'm like, oh. So they ended up giving like all of that to me for free, and I was like, I spent maybe like the last day being like emptying the ink, putting it in a thing, like cleaning them just so I could go on the plane.
Right.
As far as like markers, like there's interesting stuff. Like these are like some of the more original like 1970s like Pentel markers.
Wow.
So like the N50 and N60, like there's a bullet point and a chisel tip, but these would have been the like original, um, versions of them. So you
Those
can
are
see
cool.
the barrel design is the same, the cap design is a different color, and then you'll look at things and be like, oh, okay, like this was the first design. They changed the label, they changed this, but they kept the barrel design. They obviously kept certain bits. And then when you get into like packaging design, again, as a graphic designer, you're kind of like,
Beautiful.
oh, this is attractive to me.
Yes, me too.
How people put those together. Um, Again, the signifiers, it's like, I guess, like I like Sakura as a brand. So they'll have these, even the exterior packaging, how they put that. And then there'd be like a signifier where, SG7 is like a sort of, they used to be around a lot. Now they make them out of plastic, but the original ones, like there's things after a while, like if they have an extruded logo
Uh-huh.
on
Oh, that's
the
cool.
barrel, those
Hmm.
are older. Like before, as things continued, like they just would phase out certain design details to make it cheaper to produce.
Right.
I'd find certain things, and then even on things where it's like I'm finding if there's a UPC code on something, you're like, okay, well, this is at least 80s, like 70s. Like you try to find certain things within collecting that doesn't have UPC codes. Like to me, that is just like, oh, you're quite old at that point in time.
Wow, I've never even thought about that. That's so true. Of course, it's obvious.
These were interesting. These speed dry markers, and I always associated speed dry and magic marker with like UK, because like that's where I would find like the most like magic marker when people
Uh-huh.
say, oh, magic marker as like Kleenex or Xerox.
Right. Right.
And when I looked at it, it was like, oh, these are actually made in Japan. It's the people that produce Texta. It's the people that produce Magic Ink. They're based in Osaka. They've been around, very, very long time. But it just clicked to me that I was like, oh, the reason where Magic Marker came from is they're the same company that produces these Magic Ink markers. So it's just interesting to see that if these were like the original like glass bottle
Wow.
Magic Ink, you're like, oh, then they started producing them for like the British market, and then this is what they looked like for
Great
that.
packaging. That's amazing.
So yeah, the individual packaging, and then sometimes you see the variants, and even within this, like these are one of the more common, I think, marker brands that you see. But what I was looking for is the newer ones have UPC codes
Uh-huh.
on the exterior box, and I'm like, okay, if it doesn't have a UPC code, just go in there, clear it out. It's um, something nice to have. So a lot of the times I'd be getting things based on like I like really having full sets or packaging. Then sometimes you just find things that are like the markers themselves aren't anything, but like the package graphics are really
Very cool.
funny or cool. So this is like a generic sort of like marker set. The markers themselves are unbranded. Like these days it would have like Mickey Mouse or Frozen or
Right.
whatever on license, but even within that you'll like find these like little sticker of like, oh, this is the black cat, and you're
Yeah.
supposed to put this sticker on the marker.
Oh, those are stickers for the markers?
Yeah,
Those are cool.
so there's like an orange one, and then just
Oh,
all
very cool.
to go on them. So I was like, oh wow, this is just like a very like nice little set.
I could see this stuff also informing your graphic art. Am I wrong?
Yeah, like as you say, like icons or mascots. Yeah, just like different like layout bits. This is like a sometimes like again the packaging they'll always throw out. So whenever I get stuff, I'll always be like, can you just give me the box as well?
Right.
These aren't the box that they came with, but for Magic Ink, like the Goku die, whenever you see Goku die, it's like a pre UPC, and then
Uh-huh.
they're getting older. So like I would learn, yeah, after a while I'd learn like within each specific brand, like what makes, how do you tell if one is older than the other one,
Mm-hmm.
or other brands? And that's kind of been, something that you learn along the way, but it's been definitely, I want to in Japan, like I want to get the cream of, I want to get the cream. Like I can always get all this common stuff, but if anything, I was just
Sure.
particularly looking for, the older bits because I have
Yeah.
limited space.
Now, forgive my ignorance on this.
Yeah,
These pens are long dried up, right? They don't have ink still in them, do they?
some of them do. You can reactivate it with like rubbing alcohol. You can kind of put a dropper in it, and it'll reactivate the inkwell.
Oh,
Like if you can visualize, like usually it's just um, in the barrel of the marker, there's just usually like the sponge somewhere in there,
right,
right? That
right.
has all the ink. Like usually when you take out or unscrew the bottom, but there's still pigment and there's still like ink dust or something. And if
Yeah.
if you if you put alcohol in it and activate it, usually they'll rework. But I think before, like a lot of them would have like refillable. So even in that subset, for me, I would find these like different refills.
Yep.
So this is like a maybe like this is like mid 70s, early 80s, like ink refill.
Hmm.
So a lot of the times, I think that's what's neat about things. It's like it wasn't such a disposable society. It's like, okay, we want you to buy these things and here's the refill for it. In the same way, people that collect pens, it's like, here's the replaceable like
Hmm.
cartridges and
Hmm.
filters. And it was meant to be, the barrel lasts forever and what you're replacing is the ink. So that's why, like for the most part, I collect like markers, but then anything related to markers, like refill inks. Like this is an older Sakura um, glass bottle, like vial. What you would do is on these particular ones, it comes with like a plastic dropper.
Uh-huh.
So you'd like get the ink out, and then you just put it inside the marker, like almost like right from where the nib is, and
Uh-huh.
then let it saturate through. Um, so within the marker a bit, and that's what's interesting about collecting because I think like if I'm already there to get the markers, I'm usually finding anything else old there. Um, so if I see like these old ink refill tins, I'm like, this isn't really what I collect, but it's adjacent. So these are pretty much like similar to like Marsh T grade refill inks. It's probably the exact same vessel.
Uh-huh.
And then when I think about it, I'm like, oh, like you might have produced for that
Right.
brand. I think whenever I see things like that, it's just like the amount of packaging and time and effort that went into these things. They are really nice. Yeah, as you say, like tools of the trade. It's like what people use. I think there's something nice to be. I think maybe people are want to have tools. People want to have like tired of digital. It's like, hey, what do you use to make things? It's like
Yeah.
not as attractive to see, like, oh yeah, here's my old version of Photoshop or Illustrator. Like people love seeing, I think, creative tools and how things were
Yes.
made.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, some of it's just I think this was an interesting one. It's just like the old it's funny because it's like as much as I collect black markers, like there's a subset of collectors that all they do is collect liquid paper. So
Really?
based on that, yeah, there's these people that just collect liquid paper like pens. And based on that, I was like, they'll reach out to me and they're like, hey, if you're ever out there and you find like old liquid paper. So, I'll increase my sort of range. Like it
Uh-huh.
used to just be like, okay, black markers. But then I'd go into a store and I'm like, well, there's all these vintage markers around. I'm not going to just like leave them here. And then from there, it started being like, okay, well, if you see other things, vintage stationery, um, try to pick those up as well. So again, like the boxes, like this is an old SG7 Sakura SG7 box.
Very cool.
These are just like different. Oh yeah, so yeah, this is the action marker that I was referring to of when somebody reached out to me to see what Alexander Girard was using.
Uh-huh. That was
Um,
it? That was that style pen?
yeah, so this is what I guessed that it was. And yeah, for example, like all I saw in the picture was, oh wow, oh shit.
Oh, leaky. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, it's leaky. I just saw the uh the tip size, I saw the profile, and I saw just this rough, like grainy digitalized thing, and I saw this threading on the back. And I was like, oh, okay, like based on what I know about that company and that brand, I was like, I think it's this marker. Um, so some of the other stuff that I found in Japan is like old stationery, and then that's where I start getting into like these other sub collections.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's what's interesting when collections
Wow.
intersect. So these are like old pencil
Yep.
sets.
Oh, I
So it's
love
like,
this. This is the sort of stuff I love.
yeah, it's like if you like stationery, and then you're just like, oh, like you like
Yeah.
car stuff. You know, you start getting these intersections of
Very
things.
cool. When, like, what roundabout era are those from?
I would, well, you know,
80s?
I think car people would know better than I would based on the model of car. But if I were to say, like, yes, early 80s, like
Yeah.
all this Formula One pencil, because I'm sure there would
Yep.
be date identifiers on them. So I'd see like Harley Davidson
Yeah.
pencil
Those are
set.
wood pencils? Is that what those
Yeah,
are?
wood
Cool.
pencils. So like if you open them up, like on the barrel, they all like feature these like little like designs, I
Yep.
guess.
I remember being in the stationery store when I was like in second grade and I would collect the pencils that they sold there. Yep.
Okay.
And I
Yeah,
had a
so
collection of unused pencils for years. And then I just eventually, like, it didn't go anywhere. Not like I was consciously trying to do anything with it. I'm just saying, like, I lost interest in collecting pencils, but I wish I kept them. I wish I had them now.
there's like beauty in every individual item that you collect, and I think that's the thing is sometimes when you're just like, oh, if it means something to you and you like it, um, yeah. So like one of the things I would, see is like this time around or whatever, I was like, okay, like old, car racing related stationery.
Yeah.
And then these are really cool 80s and stuff. I've never seen this before, but it's a marker. It's like a squeeze soft vessel. Usually like whenever I see pop mate, it's just like really cheap, really plastic. I prefer collecting anything with a metal barrel or a glass barrel.
Mm-hmm.
These were like, oh wow, this is just like a really interesting like shape and design.
Yeah.
So I
Is
found
that, when I think of markers, I think of the typical magic marker shape, that long barrel. These
yeah,
little stubby ones, are those are those more widely available? Is that the proper shape of a marker? And I've had it wrong all these years.
part of me thinks that that was probably the first markers in the 50s. Like when I see some textbooks and people have this cross section of a marker, it's usually a metal jar, like a glass jar vessel, and then they have like the wick coming out and then a screw top nib. It very much looks like somebody took like an old baby food jar or something, like
Yeah.
welded the top. And that's what I say, I think those are the things. It's like, I'm not a, a researcher or historian, and sometimes I invent these stories of like, oh no, I think this is how it happened. But when I see some of these early glass bottle markers and I see the magic marker and I see all these stubby ones, I really think that was the first sort of, if you say patented or like those are the early forms of marker. I think, that was that. And then after a while it becomes, all these different shapes and different sizes.
You told me that you were attempting a Guinness World Record.
I think like it's like you grew up and you're like, oh yeah, Guinness, like, oh, that's the thing. It's like I researched on how to do it. You have to apply, and then you have to have your entire collection, and
Mm-hmm.
somebody has to come in and collect. And like I think there is something nice to be, in the same way. I won a Grammy. I want to, I got a Guinness Book of World Records. Like it is something that like legitimizes something. But
Uh-huh.
it's like I think in my, when you say it in my head, I'm like, I don't know anyone else with 1,000 markers. Like I think that's the
Right.
number.
Right.
So it's like less to me where it's like I without knowing, I'm like, I think you have to pay something to the Guinness Book.
Maybe there might be a fee.
There
Shout
might
out to
be.
Marla Mogul. I had a Guinness World Record holder for
Oh
wind-up
wow.
toys.
Oh wow, amazing.
Yeah. She was telling me about the process of getting the collection verified. You need to like send photos, you need to have somebody come and take stock in it. There is a whole set of guidelines that you have to
Yeah,
adhere to strictly to be
strictly.
recognized. Because she was telling me like once she got the record, she was having other collectors hitting her up saying that they have more, and it's also about what the Guinness people allow as an entry. She was having problems because some of her stuff was a little more blue or X-rated, a little
Okay.
bit more. Probably some wind-up toys that had like nudity or whatever
Yeah,
about them.
I've seen one.
Um,
I know which one you're referring to.
Say again.
I said I've seen the ones you're referring to.
Yeah, right. Like certain wind-up toys that are like that. I don't imagine that that's similar to markers, although there are those pens with like the pinup girls, right, and the
Yeah,
Chippendales guys.
I don't think there's
So
ever. Yeah, I don't think there's any like salacious or like X-rated markers at all.
right.
I think again, like you have your own classification, and yes, it's nice to be like the stamp of this is the collector's board, but I'd like to think that was why I would just say it's just like tagline is like quote unquote world's largest collection of black markers
Yeah,
because
it's cool.
I think other than going through the process of getting it like officially documented, not to say like so what, but I'm like okay, well I have a pretty big collection and
Yeah.
I'm pretty happy with that.
I can't believe we're getting to this question this late in the interview, but did you collect anything as a child?
Well, sure, everybody, stickers. Like, I think like when you're a kid, you're just like everything is a collection. You're like, I have a collection of sticks, I have a collection of tadpoles, I have a collection of, you know, yeah, stickers, I have a collection of like rocks. Yeah, I think collecting probably, I would like to say every human has a collection or just, you know, this is our stuff.
Right.
you
Right.
know, comic books or something. It's just like, you have your own little room or your cubby hole, or like I have, this is my collection of string that I found. This is my collection of, whatever. It's just, belongings, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, what has this collection? Um, what has it shown you? What kind of doors has it opened for you? What has it? How has it added to your life?
Um, I think it's just say like connection to craft. It's just like I think, you know, sometimes when people say like, "Hey, what do you do?" I'll be like, "Well, I think at the end of the day, I'm a good drawer, but I've expanded that to being like, okay, I can use a computer, I can do these different things, I have creative ideas, I have all these sort of, I can do all these different things. But I think sometimes like the simplicity of like, oh, at the end of the day, I think sometimes I'm like, you know what, like I'm a good drawer. If you gave me, a marker and paper, I would be like content and happy. I think that the simplicity of that, I think, is a collection of like yeah, I've always just found it's just like I'm easily amused. I think as long as I, have some drawing tools. I think sometimes, when people say like, "Oh, you have to like know how to use an iPad Pro, or you need to like use this Wacom, or you need to use this, you need to use that." I think, you know, people are like, "You need to be a muralist, you need to be using this, you need to be that." I think sometimes it's just, yeah, the bare bones like tools of the trade. I think that's one of the things that I think is the collection has been great for me. It started as a utilitarian thing. It doesn't dominate my overall, identity as like, oh my gosh, like this is all I do. I just am just enamored by what people use to express themselves or communicate. A lot of times they'll just be burnt out digitally, like creating something on a computer. But, you know, sometimes you're like, well, what am I going to draw? I'll just be like, well, I'll just I have 100 markers in a box that I haven't properly documented. I could probably just spend some time drawing. And then, yeah, I guess just all the travel bits. Like I say, it's like I know traveling is always eye-opening and it's great, but I think again, just the Japan trip and just being able to see a country and while you're pursuing, a collection. I think, yeah, sometimes people would be like, well, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm just going to visit old stationery
Yeah.
stores. And they're or like, well, that's kind of weird. And I'm like, why is it weird? It's like, I'm sure record collectors, do the same thing. Or if you're like, hey, I'm going on a snowboarding trip or I'm going on a cycling trip and these are the places you have to go. I just treated it like that. And I think, yeah, I think in that regards, it's like, yeah, through passively, if like looking for markers has led me to experience different cultures and meet different people or be in spaces that I wouldn't have been in unless I was looking for markers. I think that's been a pretty neat offshoot of it. Um, Again, is just like talking to other people that generally collect markers and are into it through different like fields of professions. I'm always just happy to trade notes and be like, oh yeah, like markers, cool.